In the early 1800s, European botanists in colonial India catalogued plants that local people already understood in practical terms. One tree stood out, Nux vomica. Its seeds carried a reputation that travelled faster than any specimen label. They were linked to hunting, pest killing, and warnings about sudden, violent deaths. To European collectors, those stories meant one thing: there was a powerful poison here, and it needed a place in Western science. Seeds and dried plant material moved along trade routes and official channels back to Europe, where naturalists treated them as both botanical samples and chemical mysteries. The question stopped being whether the seeds were dangerous. The question became what exactly caused that danger. In an age that prized classification, a vague idea like native poison was not enough. If the deadly effect was real, it had to come from something specific inside the seed. So the Nux vomica seed entered the laboratory world, where it was ground, extracted and tested with the tools of early chemistry. What had been a warning passed by word of mouth began to look like a solvable problem. The poison was no longer just a tree with a story attached. It became a target for isolation, an identifiable substance that could be separated from the plant and examined on its own. That substance soon carried a name that Europe remembered: strychnine. In the 1810s, the work changed from guessing to isolating. Chemists took the crushed seeds and tried to pull out the one ingredient that caused the violent reactions people described. Step by step, they separated a bitter substance from the rest until it behaved like a single, repeatable thing. It stopped being just a deadly seed. It became a specific chemical. It became strychnine. Once it had a name, it had a new kind of power. Researchers described its effects in clear terms, not rumours: tiny amounts, then muscle stiffness, then sudden convulsions that could come in waves. They recorded timing. They compared doses. They noted how quickly it overwhelmed the body. This mattered because it turned fear into measurement. Strychnine moved into early toxicology, where poison meant something you could quantify. And measurement led straight to trade. A purified alkaloid could be weighed, stored, and shipped with far more consistency than a handful of seeds. It could be labelled, sold, and handled by people who never saw the tree it came from. That standardization changed everything. It made strychnine portable. It made it practical. It also made it easier to misuse, because a known dose could now be prepared on purpose. As the century moved on, strychnine stopped being only a lab curiosity and started looking to some doctors like a tool. In extremely small doses, it got described as a tonic, something meant to wake the body up when it seemed weak or sluggish. Physicians tried it for a range of complaints, watching for any sign of improved appetite, energy, or nerve function. The idea sounded simple. The right dose might help, not harm. But the line between help and harm stayed thin. Strychnine acted powerfully, and tiny changes in dose could shift it from stimulating to dangerous. Still, the fact that it could be measured and prescribed gave it a new kind of respect. It appeared in medical writings as a legitimate option, not a rumour or a trick. Once that happened, it moved from the physician's experiment into the pharmacist's routine. A poison started wearing a medical label. Pharmacies began stocking strychnine the way they stocked other accepted drugs, prepared for doctors who asked for it. That routine availability mattered. It meant more patients received it, more practitioners became familiar with it, and the substance travelled farther through everyday commerce. The credibility fed the supply, and the supply reinforced the credibility. By the late 1800s, strychnine did not look rare or exotic anymore. It sat within reach, supported by mainstream medicine. By the mid-1800s, cities grew fast and crowded, and everyday life depended more on shops, doctors and pharmacies. That change mattered. Strychnine sat on shelves as a normal medicine, measured in tiny doses, sealed in small bottles, and sold with an air of respectability. But the same thing that made it convenient for treatment made it convenient for harm. A vial could travel quietly from a counter to a pocket and into the wrong hands. When suspicious deaths happened, the details shocked people. Victims went from healthy to overwhelmed in a short time, and the violence of the symptoms made it hard to dismiss as natural illness. Families looked for answers, police looked for motives, and newspapers looked for a story that would sell. Reports lingered on the idea that the poison came from a place people trusted. A medicine became a weapon, and that betrayal kept readers hooked. Courtrooms turned those deaths into public spectacle. Lawyers argued over timing, access, and whether a proper drug could really be used to kill. Doctors and chemists were pulled into the fight, asked to explain effects that most people had never seen and could barely imagine. The more these cases were printed and repeated, the more a pattern formed in the public mind. Strychnine stopped sounding like a tonic and started sounding like a crime. By the late 1800s, suspicion no longer satisfied courts. Investigators needed proof. That pressure pushed forensic science forward, and strychnine became a test case for what chemistry could deliver. Earlier, a body might show violent spasms, and everyone might think poison, but no one could point to the molecule itself. Now laboratories started treating death like a problem that could be solved, not guessed. Chemists refined their methods, learned how to pull tiny traces of alkaloids from organs, and then challenged those extracts with new reagents that produced clearer, repeatable reactions. The work stayed difficult because strychnine did not linger in obvious pools and did not advertise itself in blood. But the gap narrowed. A careful analyst could show a distinctive result, and that result could be written down, checked, and defended. That changed the courtroom. Doctors and chemists appeared as expert witnesses, not just to describe symptoms, but to explain procedures, controls, and why an outcome meant strychnine rather than rumour. Jurors heard evidence that sounded like process instead of opinion. Prosecutors gained a sharper weapon, and defense strategies shifted with it. In case after case, strychnine poisoning moved from suspicion towards something that could be proven. Around the turn of the 20th century, strychnine stopped being confined to the doctor's world. It moved into barns, fields, and ordinary homes. The reasons sounded practical. Pests cost money and spread disease, and people wanted a quick fix. Manufacturers answered with strychnine-based poisons sold for pest control. The shift mattered. A chemical once measured in tiny medicinal doses now got packaged to kill. Rodent baits became the key bridge. Mixed into grain, paste or pellets, strychnine reached places a pharmacy bottle never did. Pantries, sheds, stables and storefronts. It reached more hands too. Farmers, shopkeepers, even children who found what adults left behind. The label promised results, and it delivered them fast. But it also widened the circle of exposure, far beyond the original target. Once strychnine entered mass-market pest control, the risk changed shape. It was not only about intent anymore, it was about proximity. Bait spilled, containers got reused, and animals ate what was never meant for them. Pets, livestock, and wildlife could become collateral damage, sometimes after feeding on poisoned rodents. In practical terms, strychnine became a household and agricultural hazard, available, portable, and easy to misuse. In the early 1900s, strychnine still sat in the medical world as a drug that could be measured and prescribed, but it no longer felt like a controlled tool. As more people encountered it through work and pest control, the same chemical that promised stimulus also produced frightening mistakes. Dosage errors happened. Bottles got confused. One small misstep created a crisis because the gap between a dose and a deadly dose stayed razor thin. Hospitals and journals recorded the pattern. Patients arrived not with a vague illness, but with violent, unmistakable poisoning. Workers who handled the compound faced exposures that medicine could not explain away as rare accidents. Each report did something simple and powerful. It turned strychnine from an old remedy into a preventable risk. And at the same time, medical standards shifted. New drugs arrived with clearer benefits and wider safety margins. That change did not happen overnight, and it did not need a single scandal to force it. Confidence eroded in slow, steady steps. Doctors wrote it less. Pharmacies stocked it more cautiously. Training emphasized safer options, and the idea of using strychnine as a routine tonic started to sound outdated. Its legitimate role narrowed to a few specific uses where nothing else seemed to fit. In mainstream care, it began to disappear. By the late 20th century, the public mood shifted. People expected dangerous chemicals to be treated as dangerous, not casual. Regulators responded with broader toxic substance laws and stricter rules for poisons that had caused repeated harm. Strychnine no longer sat comfortably in the grey zone between useful tool and deadly hazard. The question stopped being whether it worked. The question became who exactly should be allowed to touch it. One pressure point came from the landscape. Strychnine baits did not always stay with the target animal. Predators and scavengers could eat poisoned pests, and the toxin moved up the food chain. That risk hit hardest in places where wildlife losses carried big consequences for ecosystems and for public trust. So authorities narrowed the legal uses: tighter licensing, tighter labeling, tighter storage rules. In some regions, certain applications were simply cut off. The practical change felt blunt. Strychnine stopped being an ordinary product and started being treated as a controlled chemical. Access required permissions, sales required records, mishandling carried real penalties. The goal was not mystery or moral panic, it was control. When a substance could kill quickly in tiny amounts, governments insisted on barriers between it and everyday life. By the end of the century, strychnine belonged less to the counter and more to regulation. By the early 2000s, strychnine no longer sat in ordinary medicine cabinets. It stayed alive in a narrower world, pest control, and only in certain places and products. That shift sounded reassuring, but it carried a new problem. The poison did not disappear. It changed how it reached people. Now, the risk came less from a doctor's dose and more from a bait, a powder, or a packet that travelled outside the rules. The headlines that followed often began the same way: an unexplained collapse, violent muscle spasms, and a race to identify the cause. Investigators then found strychnine where it never belonged, mixed into illegal drugs, or sold as something else entirely. The poison worked quickly, and the gap between taking it and losing control of the body stayed brutally short. In this era, ignorance and deception drove the danger as much as the chemical itself. Other cases looked deliberate. Strychnine turned up in targeted poisonings and contaminated food, chosen because a small amount went a long way, and beyond humans, wildlife incidents kept flaring up. Animals died after eating poisoned prey or bait set illegally, and the losses sometimes hit protected species. Each event dragged an old poison back into modern news. In the 21st century, strychnine's story stayed alive through misuse, not medicine. By the present day, strychnine sat in a very different place in public life. It got treated first as a hazard, not a remedy, and people learned its signature in plain terms: a fast-acting convulsant poison that drove violent, uncontrollable muscle spasms. That clarity changed everything. Labels, handling rules, and emergency guidance focused on speed, small doses, and the narrow window for help. The name stopped sounding exotic. It sounded like a warning. Because the risk stayed high, access tightened. In many places, it got regulated like a dangerous chemical, limited to specific uses and specific users, with controls on sale, storage, and disposal. The conversation shifted from curiosity to procedures: how to prevent exposure, how to respond to suspected poisoning, and how to document what happened. Forensic work kept it grounded in evidence, linking symptoms and chemical traces to real outcomes, not speculation. And beyond people, policy kept expanding toward the wider damage. Environmental rules treated strychnine as a threat that did not stay put, because baits and carcasses could reach unintended animals and ripple through ecosystems. The result felt blunt and unavoidable. What once entered Western science as a striking plant-derived substance ended as a tightly managed hazard, tracked through safety guidance, forensic reports, and environmental decisions. Its history written in a long record of human and animal harm.